The valley has grown too crowded. 70 people now live where 20 once thrived. The water hole that never failed now runs thin by summer's end. Hunting grounds that provided reliably now require walking twice the distance for half the game. Young adults reach maturity ready to establish their own families. But every good territory is claimed, every reliable gathering spot already spoken for by established families. This was the pressure facing your ancestors 50,000 years ago. Not a single crisis, but a slow mathematical certainty building across generations. Population doubling every 25 to 30 years. Territory remaining exactly the same size. The equation inevitable. Too many people. Not enough land. Something must change. How did they respond? How did a species adapted to familiar African landscapes transform into a global presence inhabiting every continent, every climate zone, every environment from equatorial forests to Arctic ice within just 50,000 years? Tonight's story answers that question, not through dramatic adventures or heroic journeys, but through the quiet, relentless demographic and environmental pressures that pushed humans outward generation by generation until one African species became planetary. We'll watch territories fill beyond capacity and see groups split to survive. We'll observe climate shifts turn reliable lands harsh and drive populations toward new regions. We'll follow coastal routes offering continuous abundance from the Red Sea to Australia. We'll trace river valleys providing corridors through continental interiors. We'll track animal migrations pulling hunters into northern latitudes. We'll discover how fire mastery and clothing technology made frozen environments survivable. We'll encounter Neanderthals and Denisovans already occupying the lands where modern humans arrived. We'll understand how social conflicts divided groups and human curiosity pulled explorers forward. We'll see how 20 miles moved per generation compounded across 2,000 years into transcontinental crossings. We'll follow genetic evidence mapping ancient movements in modern DNA. We'll witness ecosystems transformed by human arrival. This isn't a story about wanderlust or manifest destiny. It's about mathematics. Population pressure when groups exceed carrying capacity. Climate variability forcing adaptation. Technological capability enabling survival in diverse environments. The simple reality that successful survival produces children, children grow needing territories, and when landscapes fill, some must leave. It's about how small movements, just 20 to 50 miles when groups divided, accumulated across hundreds of generations into humanity's greatest migration, spreading one species across the entire planet without any individual traveling far from their birthplace. If you drift off before the story ends, that's perfect. These words are here to carry you gently toward rest. If you find comfort here, consider subscribing so there's always another story waiting. And if you'd like to support this work, there's a link below. For now, though, just settle in. Get comfortable. Let the modern world fade. We're going back to the moment when staying put stopped being possible, when territories filled and climates shifted and some portion of each generation looked toward adjacent valleys and began moving. And we're discovering together how humans became global, not through conquest or heroism, but through the patient, inevitable mathematics of population growth, meeting fixed geography, through climate pushing and technology enabling, through the remarkable human capacity to adapt and survive in every environment Earth offers, one generation at a time, until there was nowhere left to go. Water runs low in the valley where a group has lived for 3 generations, maybe 70 years of births and deaths in the same 20 square miles of African woodland, and each person knows every baobab tree, every seasonal waterhole, every rock where pythons sun themselves in morning light. The group began with 20 individuals, founding families who claimed this territory when it was lightly populated, resources abundant enough for their small numbers. But success brings its own pressures, because when food remains adequate and disease stays relatively low and conflicts don't dramatically increase mortality, populations double roughly every 25 to 30 years, each generation of women typically bearing 4 to 6 children, with perhaps 3 to 4 surviving to reproductive age, meaning those original 20 became 40 within 1 generation, 80 within 2, and now approaching 100 as the 3rd generation reaches childbearing years, while the territory itself, fixed at perhaps 20 square miles of savanna and woodland, offering seasonal fruits, huntable antelope and smaller game, and 3 reliable water sources during dry seasons, supports somewhere between 40 and 100 individuals sustainably with hunter-gatherer technology, the carrying capacity determined by available resources rather than by human desire or need. Foraging distances begin to stretch. What once required walking 3 to 5 miles to gather adequate plant foods now demands 8 or 10 miles, making daily food collection more time-consuming and energy-expensive, draining hours from the day that could be spent on tool-making or rest or teaching children essential skills. The good hunting spots, the river bend where antelope come to drink at dawn, the rocky outcrop overlooking game trails, the grove where birds nest abundantly each spring. All these prime locations are already claimed by established family groups, defended through custom and occasional confrontation, leaving younger adults with inferior territories or forcing them to hunt in areas already depleted by others. Water access becomes contested during the dry season when 2 of the 3 reliable sources shrink to muddy seeps, creating tension as families jostle for position at dawn and dusk, the traditional sharing arrangements straining under the weight of too many mouths. Young adults reaching 15 to 20 years old, ready to establish their own families and feed children, find difficulty securing the territory and resources necessary for independence. Every good hunting ground spoken for, every reliable food source already part of someone's range, the invisible boundaries of use rights crisscrossing the landscape in patterns learned from childhood, but now feeling constricting rather than organizing. Social friction increases as group size pushes past 70, then 80 individuals, the size where everyone's face is familiar, but consensus becomes difficult, where personality conflicts multiply, and decision-making requires exhausting negotiation among too many competing interests and family loyalties. The evening gathering that once felt warm and unified now sometimes crackles with tension, disputes over resource access, or perceived slights taking longer to resolve. The elders who once mediated easily now struggling to maintain harmony among subgroups that have grown distinct in their interests and grievances. Some of the younger adults, especially those born to families on the social periphery, those without strong claims to the best hunting territories or advantageous marriage connections, begin exploring beyond familiar boundaries during their foraging expeditions, walking an extra hour past the landmarks that mark the edge of traditional range, curious about what resources might exist in the adjacent valley to the east, where smoke from cooking fires has never risen from their group's camps. They find a river there, smaller than their own but reliable, flanked by fruit trees, not yet stripped by competing foragers, and game trails showing abundant tracks, the earth soft with prints of antelope and warthog moving undisturbed through their daily patterns. The young explorers return with stories and full gathering bags, their excitement palpable, and within a season, a subset of the group, perhaps 15 to 25 individuals, representing primarily the younger generation and a few older relatives willing to take the risk, decides to split off, to establish a new group in that eastern valley where resources lie unclaimed and the pressure of competition doesn't make every meal a calculation of scarcity. They carry fire with them, coals wrapped carefully in green leaves and clay, along with their tools and knowledge and kinship ties that will remain even across distance. But they move beyond the site of the home fires, establishing their own camps where smoke rises against unfamiliar horizons. The remaining group, now reduced back to manageable size of 50 or 60 individuals, finds that pressure eases, foraging distances shrink back toward comfortable ranges, water conflicts diminish, social tensions relax as the landscape once again provides adequately for the number of people drawing upon it. This daughter group in the Eastern Valley thrives in their new territory, and within another generation, perhaps 25 to 30 years, they too face the same mathematics, population doubling from their founding 20 to 40, then toward 80, carrying capacity once again approached and then exceeded, and some portion of their young adults begin exploring further east, or perhaps north toward different watersheds, and the process repeats, fission driven by demographic inevitability rather than by adventure or grand ambition, just the simple reality that successful survival creates more people than any fixed territory can sustainably support. This pattern, playing out not just once, but hundreds and thousands of times across countless generations and groups, creates a gradual expansion wave moving outward from any origin point at a pace determined by how frequently groups reach capacity and how far daughter groups move when they split. If groups double roughly every 25 years and reach splitting point around 75 to 80 individuals, fission occurs perhaps every 50 to 75 years. And if each daughter group moves 20 to 50 miles from their parent group seeking unclaimed territory, the expansion rate equals roughly 1 mile per year on average, variable and irregular in any particular case, but consistent across large scales and long time frames. Over 2,000 years, about 80 generations, this process could extend human presence 2,000 miles from an origin point, and over 10,000 years, human range could cover 10,000 miles, distances sufficient to span continents, all without any individual traveling more than perhaps 50 to 100 miles from their birthplace in their entire lifetime, without any conscious decision to colonize distant lands or explore unknown territories, just people having children, children growing up, territories filling, and some portion of each generation moving a short distance away to find their own space, the cumulative effect of these small movements compounding across time into continental crossings. The archaeological record confirms this gradual pattern, human presence appearing progressively farther from African origins over millennia, not in sudden leaps but in steady incremental expansion, genetic diversity decreasing with distance from Africa in patterns consistent with serial founder effects from repeated small group movements. Each daughter group carrying a subset of their parent population's genetic variation and establishing new populations that in turn spawn their own daughters. The branching tree of human expansion driven primarily by simple demographic mathematics. Population growth inevitably exceeding any territory's fixed carrying capacity, making movement not an optional cultural choice or heroic exploration, but rather an inescapable consequence of successful survival, the mathematical certainty that enough food and safety produces more children, and children become adults who need their own territories, and when the landscape is full, some must leave. The paradox sits at the heart of human expansion. That survival success creates the very pressure that forces movement. Each improvement in tool technology or hunting technique or food preservation method enabling slightly more children to survive to adulthood, and those additional survivors need additional resources, pushing populations repeatedly against the ceiling of what any given territory can sustainably provide. A group develops better spear points, more effective killing power, meaning higher hunting success rates, and for one generation, perhaps two, this innovation brings abundance, easier meat acquisition, better nutrition, supporting healthier children. But within 50 years, the population has grown to match this new productivity level. The carrying capacity temporarily increased by technology now filled again with people, and the pressure returns. Foraging distances extending once more, conflicts over resources resuming, the advantage of innovation absorbed entirely into more mouths to feed rather than into permanent abundance for stable population size. The demographic momentum operates with relentless mathematical certainty, women in their reproductive years bearing children at intervals determined by biology and nursing patterns, perhaps one birth every 3 to 4 years on average, and with adequate nutrition and relative safety. Perhaps 3 or 4 of those children surviving to have their own children, meaning each woman successfully raises more than the 2 children needed to replace herself and her partner, the excess becoming population growth that compounds generation after generation until territory fills. Hunter-gatherer populations studied in modern times show this pattern clearly. Groups living in resource-rich environments with low disease pressure and minimal conflict growing at rates that would double population every 20 to 30 years if unchecked. And the mechanism that checks this growth isn't increased mortality, but rather group fission and territorial expansion, some portion of each growing population splitting off to colonize adjacent areas before resource depletion becomes catastrophic, before conflicts escalate into violence, before the delicate social fabric tears under the strain of too many competing interests packed into too little space. The rhythm of this expansion process creates pulses of movement radiating outward from population centers. Daughter groups budding off every few generations when parent groups reach critical mass, and those daughter groups establishing themselves in new territories where they in turn grow and bud, the expanding wave front not smooth and continuous, but rather lumpy and irregular, advancing faster where resources are rich and terrain passable, stalling where deserts or mountains or other barriers make settlement difficult, accelerating during favorable climate periods when food becomes more abundant, and slowing during harsher eras when carrying capacity drops and groups struggle just to maintain stable numbers. Archaeological evidence reveals this irregular advance in the density and distribution of sites over time, human presence appearing in southern Asia and Australia relatively quickly, perhaps within 10 to 15,000 years of leaving Africa, following resource-rich coastal routes where marine foods provided abundant calories and movement faced few barriers, while penetration into Europe's interior took longer, groups advancing and retreating with glacial cycles, sometimes abandoning territories during extreme cold and recolonizing during warmer intervals, the net movement over millennia trending toward greater geographic spread, but with local reversals and pauses embedded in the larger pattern. Genetic evidence confirms the demographic story. Modern populations carrying signatures of ancient expansion events written in the patterns of variation across chromosomes, mitochondrial DNA showing branching lineages as groups split and diverged, Y chromosome lineages revealing male-mediated movements and founder effects, overall genetic diversity decreasing with distance from Africa, exactly as expected if small groups repeatedly budded off from parent populations, each carrying only a subset of the variation present in their origin group and establishing new populations from that reduced genetic base. The serial founder effects accumulating with each step to create the gradient of diversity that stretches from high variation in Africa to progressively lower variation in populations farther along ancient migration routes. Population density remained relatively low throughout this expansion process, perhaps 1 to 10 people per 100 square miles across most landscapes, because the driver of movement wasn't just absolute scarcity, but relative pressure. The point at which foraging becomes inefficient enough and social friction becomes uncomfortable enough that splitting off a daughter group becomes more attractive than staying put. Groups didn't wait until they were starving or at war with neighbors. They divided while resources remained adequate, but competition had grown tedious. While relationships were strained but not broken, the fission process typically peaceful if occasionally laden with emotion, families deciding which branch to join, some individuals leaving familiar territory reluctantly, others eager for the freedom and opportunity that comes with establishing something new. The daughter groups typically moved just far enough to escape direct competition with their parent group, 20 to 100 miles depending on terrain and resource distribution, far enough that daily foraging ranges didn't overlap significantly, close enough that occasional visits and information exchange remained possible, maintaining social and genetic connections even across geographic separation. This pattern of nearby settlement meant that the advancing wavefront of human presence had depth, not a thin line of pioneers pushing into empty wilderness, but rather a thickening band of related groups maintaining loose contact, intermarrying occasionally, sharing information about resources and dangers, creating a network of human presence that gradually extended outward from African origins across Asia and eventually Europe and beyond, each group connected to neighbors who were connected to their neighbors in turn. A continuous, if attenuated web of kinship and culture stretching across thousands of miles and hundreds of generations. The success of this expansion pattern depended critically on the ability to maintain viable population size in daughter groups. Too small a founding population, risking extinction from disease or accident, or simple bad luck in sex ratio of children. Too large a split, depleting the parent group excessively and creating the same resource pressure that motivated fission in the first place. Founding groups of 15 to 30 individuals seem to have been common, based on genetic modeling of founder effects and social organizational principles observed in modern hunter-gatherers, large enough to include multiple family units and adequate genetic diversity for healthy reproduction, small enough to be sustainable when carving out new territory from unclaimed or lightly populated landscapes. These founding groups needed comprehensive knowledge and skill sets, individuals capable of hunting, gathering, tool making, shelter construction, fire maintenance, child care, and all the other essential activities of survival, meaning that daughter groups typically included a cross-section of ages and talents rather than just young adults, experienced elders, and skilled craftspeople joining the split to ensure the new group could function independently from the moment of separation. The social and technological complexity of human groups meant that successful colonization wasn't simply a matter of walking to new territory and starting over. It required carrying a complete cultural package, the accumulated knowledge and techniques and social practices that enabled survival. And this portability of culture, the ability to recreate a fully functional society wherever the group stopped, was perhaps the critical enabler of human expansion, allowing small groups to establish themselves successfully in unfamiliar environments far from their ancestral homeland. Rain fails to come in the season when it should arrive. When generations of memory say clouds gather over the eastern hills and water falls abundantly for several weeks, filling water holes and greening the grasses and bringing the antelope down from dry highlands to graze the temporarily lush valleys. But this year, the clouds stay thin and scattered, a few storms dropping brief showers that barely dampen the dust before heat sucks moisture back into the air, and the water holes that usually brim with fresh rainwater instead show cracked mud and a shrinking pool surrounded by desperate animals competing for access. The next season brings similar failure, and the one after that, a pattern stretching across several years that transforms familiar landscape from productive territory into harsh, struggling ecosystem where plants produce fewer seeds and fruits, where game animals grow lean and wary and move constantly in search of forage, where human foraging distances must extend to cover areas previously unnecessary to visit, where careful rationing and storage become essential rather than occasional precautions. Climate records preserved in lake sediments and cave formations and ice cores reveal that such periods of dramatic change were not rare events, but rather common features of the past 100,000 years, cycles of wet and dry periods alternating across decades and centuries, sudden shifts from relatively mild conditions to harsh extremes occurring sometimes within a single human lifetime. Glacial advances bringing cold and aridity to vast regions, while glacial retreats opened new territories and altered rainfall patterns globally. For human populations living close to the edge of sustainability, these climate fluctuations created pressures that made staying in place increasingly risky. The familiar territory that supported a group comfortably during good years becoming marginal during bad ones, and multi-year droughts or cooling episodes pushing groups toward hard choices about where and how to survive. African megadroughts during glacial periods reduced habitable areas dramatically, lake levels dropping, rivers diminishing, the productive zones where human groups clustered shrinking like water evaporating from a puddle, concentrating populations into smaller and smaller refugia, where permanent water persisted, creating competition among groups forced into proximity by climate rather than by choice. Archaeological evidence from these periods shows occupation concentrated around major river systems and lakes that maintained water through dry millennia, while vast areas of savanna and woodland show little or no human presence during extreme drought phases, suggesting that climate variability didn't just make life difficult but actually forced abandonment of large territories, groups migrating toward reliable water sources and either displacing earlier occupants or attempting to share increasingly crowded landscapes. The pressure during these episodes must have been intense, not just the physical hardship of scarcity, but also the social tension of compressed populations, conflicts over resources escalating when too many groups competed for too few good territories, the violence and stress adding to climate pressure as motivations to move, to seek new territories beyond the crowded refugia, even if those territories lay in directions that required crossing harsh landscapes or adapting to unfamiliar environments. Some groups must have chosen movement over competition, small bands breaking away from the contested refugia and heading toward wetter regions or cooler highlands or coastal areas where different resource bases might support survival, even if familiar inland foods had become scarce. Heinrich events, massive ice sheet destabilizations occurring roughly every 7 to 10,000 years during glacial periods, disrupted climate across the northern hemisphere suddenly and dramatically. Massive releases of icebergs into the North Atlantic, altering ocean circulation and atmospheric patterns, bringing cold and aridity to Europe and North Africa and the Middle East within decades or even years. transforming landscapes too quickly for gradual adaptation. Groups living through these events faced not the slow pressure of multi-generational change, but rather the shock of seeing familiar territories become nearly uninhabitable within their own lifetimes. Forests giving way to tundra, rivers freezing where they had never frozen before, game animals shifting ranges or disappearing entirely, the ecological structure that supported human survival collapsing and reforming into something foreign. Movement during these crises wasn't optional, it was survival imperative. And the archaeological record shows population contractions and relocations associated with these climatic upheavals, human presence disappearing from some regions and appearing or intensifying in others. The geographic distribution of groups shifting like pieces on a board as climate changed the rules of where survival was possible. These forced migrations must have been traumatic. Groups abandoning territories their ancestors had occupied for generations, leaving behind familiar caves and hunting grounds and the bones of their dead, carrying only what could be transported and the knowledge in their minds as they sought refuge in lands that offered better climate conditions, even if everything else about those lands was unknown and potentially dangerous. Monsoon failures in Africa and Asia created similar pressures on different timescales. The seasonal rains that governed food production in tropical and subtropical regions, occasionally shifting patterns or weakening for years at a time, bringing famine conditions to groups dependent on the regular cycles of wet and dry. When monsoons failed, rivers diminished, lakes dried, the flush of plant growth that followed rains never materialized or came up sparse and weak. Game animals migrated away from affected regions seeking better forage, and human groups faced the choice of staying and starving or moving to track the shifting resources. The predictable seasonality that allowed human groups to plan food storage and organize their annual movements became unreliable during climate instability, undermining the sophisticated calendar knowledge and resource scheduling that made sedentary or semi-sedentary life possible, forcing groups back into more mobile patterns just to maintain contact with adequate resources. Climate variability created an insurance value to geographic spread, groups that occupied only a single territory putting all their survival eggs in one environmental basket, vulnerable to local climate failures destroying their resource base, while populations spread across multiple territories in different regions with different climate patterns maintained options. A drought devastating one area might leave another relatively unaffected, allowing movement and mutual support among related groups occupying diverse environments. The accumulated effect of these climate pressures over tens of thousands of years was a population constantly nudged and sometimes shoved toward geographic expansion. Favorable periods allowing population growth that then became unsustainable when conditions shifted, forcing groups to split and move. Harsh periods making familiar territories marginal and motivating exploration of alternatives. The combination of demographic pressure during good times and climate pressure during bad times, creating nearly continuous impetus for movement, advancing the frontier of human presence steadily, if irregularly, outward from African origins. Groups that remained flexible, willing to move when conditions deteriorated, able to exploit new environments as they became available, survived and proliferated, passing those adaptive capabilities to their descendants, while groups that clung to deteriorating territories or failed to develop broad adaptability faced higher extinction risks. The selective pressure over thousands of generations favoring the restless, the flexible, the capable of making homes in diverse environments rather than those specialized to single landscapes. This didn't require any conscious strategy of exploration or expansion, just the practical responses to immediate climate challenges and the cumulative effect of those responses pushing populations ever outward across the landscape. The same drought that forced one group to move east, creating space and opportunity that encouraged neighboring groups to shift as well. The movements cascading and compounding until the species that originated in tropical Africa found itself inhabiting every climate zone from equatorial rainforests to northern tundras. Not because of any grand plan, but because climate kept changing and humans kept adapting by moving. The sea lies at the edge of the known world, where the land ends and water extends beyond sight, waves rolling onto beaches that stretch for miles, and the tide moving in and out twice daily exposes zones of productivity unlike anything found inland. Shellfish clinging to rocks accessible at low tide, fish trapped in shallow pools, seabirds nesting on cliffs and laying eggs that can be gathered. Seaweed lying in heaps along the strand, useful for food and other purposes. The coastal zone offering a renewable resource base that doesn't depend on seasonal rains or successful hunts, but rather arrives with reliable tidal rhythm, regardless of what happens in the interior grasslands and forests. A group reaching the coast for the first time, perhaps pushed toward the shoreline by drought, making inland territories difficult, or by population pressure forcing exploration of marginal areas, discovers this abundance and adapts quickly, learning which shellfish can be eaten safely, how to predict tides using moon phases and local landmarks, where fish concentrate during different seasons, how to collect and process seaweeds and other marine plants, the techniques accumulating through observation and experiment until the group possesses comprehensive knowledge of coastal resources that rivals their traditional expertise in hunting and gathering terrestrial foods. The productivity per unit effort often exceeds inland foraging. Spending 2 hours collecting shellfish at low tide might yield as many calories as spending 8 hours tracking and hunting game animals. The efficiency making coastal life attractive enough that groups settle along shorelines more densely than they occupied interior regions, but even with higher population density, the coast continues providing, because the ocean represents a resource base orders of magnitude larger than any land-based territory. Fish and shellfish populations extending offshore beyond human exploitation capacity given the simple technologies available, creating what seems like inexhaustible abundance compared to the careful management required for inland hunting territories with their finite game populations easily over-harvested. Following coastlines becomes a natural strategy for range expansion, movement along the beach encountering similar resources repeatedly as the shore extends mile after mile. The group walking south or north along familiar coastal environments, encountering new territories that require minimal adaptation, because the fundamentals of coastal foraging remain constant even as specific details change with latitude and local geography. This coastal migration route offered pathway out of Africa, following shorelines from the Red Sea exit through southern Arabia along the Persian Gulf coast into the Indian Ocean, littoral and continuing through Southeast Asia toward Australia. A journey spanning thousands of miles, but presenting continuous resource availability and minimal barriers to movement, no mountain ranges to cross, no arid zones to traverse where water and food disappear for weeks. Just the ongoing presence of the shore with its reliable tidal foods and the gradually changing but broadly similar coastal ecosystems. Sea levels during glacial periods stood 200 to 300 feet lower than today as massive ice sheets locked up water, exposing continental shelves that are now underwater, dramatically widening the coastal plains and creating extended shorelines that stretched much farther seaward than present geography shows, and these exposed shelves provided even richer resources: additional shallow water habitats for shellfish and fish, more beach area for foraging, essentially a highway of abundance guiding human groups along maritime routes toward distant continents. Evidence for this coastal migration comes from multiple sources. Genetic data showing that modern populations in southern Asia and Australia share ancestry, suggesting migration along southern routes rather than through Central Asian highlands. The timing of human arrival in Australia approximately 50,000 years ago, requiring marine crossings from Southeast Asia that suggest maritime capability and coastal adaptation, archaeological sites along ancient shorelines showing early human presence focused on marine resources, shell middens and fish bones preserving evidence of coastal lifestyles stretching back tens of thousands of years. The speed of coastal migration exceeded inland expansion rates significantly. Groups moving along productive shorelines able to advance 20 to 50 miles per generation without difficulty, because each new stretch of coast provided immediate resources requiring no learning period or technology adjustment, the accumulated movement covering hundreds of miles per century, thousands of miles per millennium, rapid enough to explain human arrival in Australia within perhaps 5 to 15,000 years of leaving Africa, if the route followed shorelines continuously through southern Asia. This rapidity came from the absence of hard barriers and the presence of continuous resources. Coastal groups never facing the choice of starving in place or risking movement into completely unknown territory, because the next stretch of beach promised the same foods they already knew how to exploit, reducing the risk of exploration to near zero and making continuous movement relatively easy and safe compared to inland expansion that required crossing different ecosystem types with different resource bases and different survival requirements. The coastal route also offered refuge from competition with other human species and with established populations. Neanderthals occupying Europe and Western Asia had adapted to inland environments. Their territories focused on terrestrial hunting and their cultures optimized for continental interiors, leaving coastal zones relatively empty of hominin presence and creating opportunity for arriving Homo sapiens groups to establish themselves without direct confrontation. The shoreline provided buffer zone and alternative lifestyle that minimized contact with inland competitors while building population bases that eventually expanded into interior regions from coastal footholds. The maritime adaptation allowing humans to essentially bypass occupied territories by moving through underutilized niches. Similarly, moving along coasts reduced encounters with large terrestrial predators, the shore offering escape routes into shallow water that terrestrial hunters avoided, creating relatively safer camping locations and foraging areas compared to inland zones where lions and hyenas and other predators competed directly with human hunters for game animals and sometimes hunted humans themselves. The transition from terrestrial hunter-gatherers to coastal foragers required behavioral flexibility and learning, but not fundamental technological innovation. The same stone tools used for processing game animals and plant foods worked adequately for opening shellfish and processing fish and seaweeds. The same fire technology that cooked meat-cooked seafood equally well. The same shelter construction principles applied to coastal camps, meaning that groups reaching the shore could adopt marine foraging without needing entirely new cultural packages, just extensions and modifications of existing knowledge. This adaptability, the capacity to learn new resource bases and add them to existing repertoires rather than replacing one lifestyle with another, characterized human expansion more generally. Groups didn't abandon terrestrial foraging when they reached coasts, but rather added coastal foraging to their options. maintaining flexibility to exploit inland resources during certain seasons while focusing on marine resources at other times. The mixed economy providing more resilience and stability than relying on single resource type. The combination of high productivity, continuous availability, ease of movement, reduced competition, and compatibility with existing technologies made coastal migration routes the express lanes of human expansion, advancing the human presence around the rim of the Indian Ocean and into Australasia far faster than inland groups penetrated continental interiors, establishing populations in distant lands that only much later developed the technologies and adaptations necessary to fully occupy interior regions of those continents. Water flows from highlands to lowlands, following gravity's inevitable pull, collecting in streams that merge into rivers that grow wider and deeper as they approach the sea. And these watercourses provide natural corridors through landscapes, reliable water sources that never dry completely, even during droughts, linear oases that concentrate plant and animal life along their banks, creating zones of productivity that stand out from surrounding territories like green threads through brown fabric during dry seasons. Human groups settle along rivers preferentially, camps clustered on terraces above flood zones where water access is easy but flooding doesn't destroy shelters. Foraging focused on the riparian zones where plants grow lush and diverse, hunting concentrated on game trails leading to drinking places, fishing providing additional protein when terrestrial game proves scarce, the riverine environment offering multiple food sources and generally higher productivity than equivalent areas distant from water. Following rivers becomes natural behavior for groups learning their territories, tracking streams upstream toward sources or downstream toward larger flows. The watercourses providing navigation aids and destination goals, and when population pressure or climate shifts or simple curiosity motivates movement beyond familiar ranges, rivers offer obvious pathways. Follow the water and resources remain available. Follow the drainage and the route stays clear of the worst obstacles, the path already carved by flowing water providing easier passage than crossing watersheds and ridges requires. The Nile offered particularly important migration corridor from tropical Africa into Mediterranean zones, the river flowing north through thousands of miles of otherwise arid landscape, creating ribbon of life through desert where survival off the river would be impossible for most of the year. Groups moving along the Nile encountering familiar riverine resources, even as the surrounding environment transitioned from tropical to subtropical to temperate zones. The river essentially allowing humans to slide north along a constant environment type rather than adapting abruptly to the very different ecosystems that existed away from the water. Archaeological sites along the Nile show human presence extending progressively northward over tens of thousands of years, groups establishing camps and settlements along the river's course, some staying in place for generations while others continued moving. The accumulated effect being gradual population expansion from sub-Saharan Africa into North Africa and eventually into the Middle East, following the Nile to its delta, and then continuing along Mediterranean shores or inland through the Levant. The Danube provided similar corridor through Europe, flowing from central mountains to the Black Sea, connecting diverse environments and providing migration pathway that human groups followed both eastward and westward depending on specific historical circumstances. The river valley offering productive territories and movement routes that facilitated population expansion across the European continent during interglacial periods when climate made northern regions habitable. Asian river systems, massive watercourses draining the Himalayas and other mountain ranges, carved valleys through continental interiors, and provided corridors for human movement into East Asia and eventually toward northern regions, groups following the Indus or the Ganges or the Yangtze, finding pathways through varied terrain that maintained water and resources throughout the journey. The rivers essentially functioning as highways for both human movement and cultural diffusion. Trade goods and technologies and genes all flowing along the drainage networks as groups moved and settled and interacted. The productivity of river valleys attracted and sustained larger populations than most other environments, flooding, depositing nutrient-rich sediments that fertilized floodplains and created seasonal abundance of plants growing from the enriched soil. Fish runs providing concentrated protein during spawning seasons when millions of individuals move upstream, creating harvest opportunities that could feed groups for weeks from just a few days of intensive fishing, waterfowl, and other birds concentrating along rivers during migrations and creating additional seasonal bonanzas. This enhanced productivity meant that river valleys could support more humans per unit area than most terrestrial environments, allowing populations to grow larger before reaching carrying capacity that forced splits, but also making river territories more contested, groups defending productive riverine zones more intensely than they defended less productive uplands, creating pressure that pushed marginal groups away from the best river sections and into tributary valleys or upland areas where population density was lower and competition less intense. The combination of high productivity and clear movement corridors meant that major river systems acted as both population centers and dispersal routes, groups accumulating along productive middle and lower river reaches, while excess population moved upstream toward tributaries or downstream toward deltas and coasts, the branching structure of drainage networks mirroring the branching structure of population splits. Each tributary potentially hosting separate groups that maintained connection through the main river channel, interacting during certain seasons when travel along the water was easy, separating during other seasons when each group focused on their particular stretch of the drainage system. River travel itself provided technological advantages once humans developed watercraft, even simple rafts or boats, allowing transport of goods and people much more efficiently than overland travel, a journey that might take weeks on foot, reduced to days by floating downstream. The ease of water transport, facilitating movement and trade, and maintaining social connections across longer distances than would be practical with purely terrestrial travel. The earliest evidence for watercraft comes from island colonization requiring water crossings. Australia reached approximately 50,000 years ago, requiring boats capable of crossing 60 miles of open ocean even during low sea levels. Southeast Asian archipelagos showing human presence requiring repeated water crossings. The development of maritime technology opening island and coastal territories to colonization, while also making river travel more efficient and extending the reach of human movement along waterways. Rivers also provided natural boundaries between group territories, the watercourse marking clear division between this side and that side, reducing ambiguity about territorial boundaries and potentially reducing conflicts compared to areas where boundaries followed subtle topographic features easily disputed. Different groups occupying opposite banks of a river could maintain separate territories while sharing the resource of the river itself, fishing from their respective sides, drawing water without conflict over access, the river functioning both as division and as shared amenity. During low water seasons, when rivers narrow or break into disconnected pools, crossing becomes easier and interaction between groups on opposite banks increases, while high water seasons create effective barriers that separate populations and reduce contact. the seasonal fluctuation in barrier effectiveness potentially contributing to patterns of genetic exchange that show evidence of periodic mixing between otherwise separated populations, gene flow pulsing with the river's flow, higher during dry seasons when movement across the channel is easy, lower during floods when the river becomes impassable barrier. The long-term effect of following rivers was progressive expansion of human range along all major drainage systems, population spreading from river mouths upstream toward sources and from major rivers into tributary valleys. The branching network of waterways eventually filled with human presence as groups fissioned and moved following the obvious pathways that water carved through the landscape. And once rivers were occupied relatively densely, excess population had to move beyond the riverine corridors into uplands and dry zones and other less optimal territories, filling in the spaces between drainage networks and eventually occupying the full diversity of environments across continents rather than just the privileged linear oases that rivers created. Reindeer herds move north in spring, following the melting snow line toward summer pastures, where fresh grass grows abundant and insects remain tolerable in the brief Arctic warmth. And human groups who have learned to depend on these animals for meat and hides and bone tools follow the migration, walking the same routes year after year, the timing predictable enough that people know when to break winter camps and begin the northward trek, pacing their movement to stay within hunting range of the herds, without pressuring them so intensely that the animals alter their traditional migration paths. The relationship between human hunters and migratory prey creates annual movement patterns that can extend hundreds of miles from winter ranges to summer ranges and back again, the human groups essentially becoming semi-nomadic, their territories defined not by fixed boundaries, but by the seasonal circuit that follows animal movements, and over generations, this following behavior gradually extends human range northward as groups track herds into territories their ancestors never visited, the pursuit of familiar prey pulling populations into unfamiliar landscapes, adapting to new environments not through deliberate exploration, but through the simple necessity of maintaining contact with food sources that refuse to stay still. Archaeological evidence shows human sites clustered along known migration routes, kill sites where herds were intercepted and processed appearing repeatedly in the same locations used across centuries. The geographic distribution of these sites mapping the ancient pathways that animals followed and humans pursued, and the northern extent of human presence correlating closely with the northern extent of reindeer and other large herbivore migrations, suggesting that animals led and humans followed, the expansion into Arctic and subarctic zones driven primarily by tracking prey rather than by independent human exploration of high latitudes. Salmon runs provide similar motivation for movement and range extension, fish swimming upstream from ocean to spawning grounds in rivers and streams at predictable times each year. The runs concentrated enough that people positioned at good fishing spots could harvest enormous quantities in just weeks, enough to smoke and dry and store to provide food through many months. But exploiting this resource required being in the right place at the right time, learning which rivers hosted runs and when the fish would arrive, developing the specialized knowledge and technologies for efficient harvest, nets and weirs and spears designed specifically for catching migrating salmon in the narrow confines of streams where the fish concentrated. Groups that discovered productive salmon runs returned to them annually, establishing seasonal camps along riverbanks, developing storage technologies and preservation techniques to handle the sudden abundance, but also maintaining ties to other seasonal resources in different locations. The annual round incorporating salmon fishing into a broader pattern of movements timed to exploit different foods as they became available in different places. berries ripening in one area, while salmon ran in another, while game animals concentrated near water sources in yet another location. The human population distributing itself across the landscape seasonally to match where food was most available at any given time. This seasonal mobility pulled groups gradually into new territories as they learned of salmon runs in previously unknown rivers, or discovered that berry patches extended farther than previously explored, or found that game animals could be intercepted along migration routes in areas beyond traditional hunting grounds, each addition to seasonal movement patterns incrementally expanding the geographic range occupied and known, until groups possessed detailed knowledge of territories spanning hundreds of miles that they visited regularly but never occupied permanently, the landscape becoming a patchwork of seasonal destinations rather than a single fixed home territory. Bird migrations created similar patterns, though less dramatically. Waterfowl and other species concentrating in vast numbers during spring and fall migrations at marshes and lakes and coastal areas where they stopped to rest and feed, creating brief windows of extreme abundance that human groups learned to exploit by positioning themselves at these concentration points during migration seasons, harvesting birds and collecting eggs and processing enough to contribute significantly to the annual food supply. Knowing where and when these migration stops occurred required geographic knowledge extending beyond areas visited regularly for other purposes, groups learning about distant marshes through information exchange with neighbors or through exploratory scouting. And once productive bird concentration areas became known, they entered the annual movement cycle, adding another destination to the circuit of seasonal camps, expanding total territory as these specialized resource sites got incorporated into the yearly round. The cumulative effect of following multiple species with different migration patterns and seasonal availability was human groups maintaining extremely broad geographic knowledge and mobility, visiting different parts of their range at different times of year, moving constantly through an annual cycle that might cover several hundred miles of total travel distance, and this mobility created familiarity with vast territories and maintained awareness of what lay beyond current ranges, making the transition to actually moving permanently into adjacent territories less daunting because those territories were already partially known through seasonal visits or information from neighbors who visited them. Tracking animal movements also taught navigational skills and environmental knowledge that proved essential for successful range expansion. Learning to read weather patterns that predicted when herds would move, understanding how snow depth and forage availability influenced animal distributions, recognizing the landscape features that channeled migrations through predictable routes. All of this knowledge applicable to human movement as well. The same principles that predicted where to intercept reindeer also suggested where human groups could travel efficiently and where they would find water and shelter and other necessities. Animals served as expert guides to landscape possibilities, their presence indicating what environments could support large mammal life and therefore might support human life, their absence warning of territories too harsh or unproductive for sustainable occupation, following proven animal routes, providing some assurance that the path led somewhere viable rather than into dead ends or impassable barriers. The relationship with migratory prey also created cultural and psychological orientations toward mobility rather than permanence. Groups that spent much of each year traveling to follow animals or visit seasonal resource sites developing identities as travelers, finding satisfaction and meaning in movement itself rather than viewing it as hardship to endure. Children growing up expecting annual migrations as normal rather than as disruption, The whole cultural framework adapted to mobile lifestyles that made the idea of moving to entirely new territories less foreign and frightening than it might have been for groups more attached to permanent settlements and fixed territories. When population pressure or climate change or other factors made movement necessary, groups already comfortable with mobility and already possessing the skills and knowledge for traveling long distances and establishing temporary camps could transition relatively easily to longer distance migration and permanent relocation. The cultural and practical foundations already established through generations of following animal migrations, just the scale and direction of movement changing rather than the fundamental nature of mobile existence. Fire sits at the center of human technological capability, the controlled flame providing warmth that allows survival in climates too cold for naked apes, the heat for cooking that makes many foods digestible and safe that would be inedible or toxic raw, the light that extends useful hours beyond sunset into evening and night, the protection that keeps dangerous animals at respectful distance, the social focus around which groups gather for warmth and conversation and shared meals, and critically for range expansion. Fire is portable, coals wrapped carefully in green leaves or clay, maintaining embers that can be transported for hours or even days, and then blown back to flame when needed, allowing groups to carry this essential technology wherever they travel, rather than being restricted to areas where natural fires provide starting materials or where fire-starting techniques can reliably generate new flame. The ability to maintain and transport fire meant that humans could occupy territories where fuel existed, but where starting fire from scratch might be difficult or impossible due to damp conditions or absence of suitable friction materials. The carried fire providing reliability that made new environments less risky to enter, knowing that as long as coals survived and fuel could be gathered, warmth and cooking and protection would be available regardless of other local conditions. Archaeological evidence shows human use of fire extending back hundreds of thousands of years, hearths appearing in caves and open sites, burned bones and charcoal deposits marking where people gathered around flames. But the technology reached critical importance for range expansion when humans began moving into temperate and cold environments where winter temperatures would quickly kill unprotected individuals. Fire making the difference between impossible and merely difficult survival in northern latitudes and high elevations. Clothing represents the other critical portable technology enabling environmental range expansion. Animal hides and furs processed and sewn into garments that provide insulation against cold, allowing body heat retention that naked skin cannot maintain in freezing conditions. And like fire, clothing is portable, the technology traveling with the group rather than being fixed to particular locations, meaning that once humans developed adequate clothing systems, they could survive in any terrestrial environment where food and fuel existed regardless of temperature extremes. The development of sophisticated clothing probably occurred gradually over tens of thousands of years, starting with simple hides draped over shoulders for warmth, advancing to tailored garments fitted to body shape for better insulation and mobility, eventually reaching systems of multiple layers, including footwear and hand coverings and head protection that together maintained core body temperature even in Arctic conditions. The full technological package enabling human occupation of far northern regions during glacial periods and high mountain zones where unclothed humans would die of exposure within hours. Evidence for clothing development comes partly from archaeological finds of bone needles and other sewing tools appearing around 40,000 years ago, suggesting that by that time humans were creating fitted garments rather than just using rough wraps, but also from genetic evidence showing that body lice, which live in clothing rather than on skin, diverged from head lice approximately 70,000 years ago, implying that humans began wearing clothing regularly enough to create a new ecological niche for parasites by that time, the molecular clock of lice evolution recording the history of clothing use, even where the garments themselves have long since rotted away, leaving no physical trace. The combination of fire and clothing created thermal independence, the ability to maintain adequate body temperature across the full range of terrestrial environments from equatorial to Arctic, liberating humans from the tropical and subtropical zones where naked apes are thermally comfortable and opening the entire planet to potential colonization. The technological insulation against cold proving as important as biological adaptations in other species that evolved thick fur or large body size or seasonal hibernation to cope with temperature extremes. Humans instead adapted culturally and technologically, maintaining tropical primate bodies while extending range through behavioral and technological buffers against environmental conditions, the approach proving remarkably successful and flexible because cultural adaptations could change within generations rather than requiring the thousands of generations necessary for biological evolution. Groups moving into new climate zones, developing appropriate clothing systems and fire management practices within decades rather than waiting millennia for evolutionary adaptation. The speed of cultural change enabling rapid geographic expansion that biological adaptation alone could never have supported. Other portable technologies contributed to expansion capability, though perhaps less dramatically than fire and clothing. Hafted tools where stone points were attached to wooden handles created more effective weapons and butchering implements. The technology portable because knowledge of hafting techniques and ability to find or make adhesives and bindings could be carried mentally and applied to locally available materials anywhere groups traveled, not requiring specific resources available only in certain locations. Food storage and preservation technologies, methods for drying meat and fish, techniques for protecting stored foods from spoilage and pests, knowledge of which plant foods could be stored and for how long. All these portable technologies reduced the risk of movement by enabling groups to carry food supplies with them during travel and to buffer against seasonal scarcity by saving foods from times of abundance to consume during scarcity. The reduction in risk making exploration and range expansion safer and therefore more likely to succeed. Shelter construction knowledge likewise traveled with groups. Understanding of how to build windbreaks and weather-resistant structures using local materials meant that humans could create adequate shelter wherever they stopped, not requiring caves or natural rock shelters, able to occupy open plains and forests and coastlines that lacked ready-made protective features. The flexibility in shelter construction dramatically expanding the portion of landscape available for occupation beyond the limited areas where natural shelter existed. Water transport and storage technologies, containers made from bladders or skins or bark or woven plant materials, allowed groups to travel through areas where water sources were widely spaced, carrying enough to survive multiple days between reliable water points, opening arid and semi-arid zones to crossing that would be impossible without water-carrying capability. The technology not sophisticated or complex, but absolutely essential for movement through dry regions that formed barriers between occupied territories. The cumulative effect of these portable technologies was to transform the human species from one adapted to specific environment types into one capable of exploiting virtually any terrestrial environment. The technological toolkit creating flexibility that made geographic expansion both possible and practical. Each new environment requiring some adjustments and innovations, but not requiring fundamental restructuring of the entire cultural system. groups arriving in cold regions, adding warmer clothing and more intensive fire use, but maintaining their basic social organization and food-getting strategies and cultural practices with modifications rather than wholesale replacement. This technological portability stands as perhaps the key enabler of the remarkable speed of human expansion across the planet. The ability to carry survival capacity mentally and in simple material culture rather than requiring biological adaptation or dependence on specific geographic features meant that humans could colonize new continents within thousands of years, rather than the millions of years required for evolution to produce new species adapted to those continents. The technological approach to environmental challenges proving faster and more flexible than biological approaches, allowing one African species to become global without splitting into multiple species, each adapted to different regions, maintaining biological unity through cultural diversity. The same human bodies from equator to Arctic surviving through different clothing and fire management rather than through different genetics. The land ahead shows signs of previous occupation, stone tools of unfamiliar style lying on the surface at places where clearly someone sat and worked stone into usable form, butchered animal remains with cut marks that speak of different techniques than the approaching group uses, occasional glimpses of smoke rising from valleys suggesting camps and fires maintained by others. And as the advancing group moves into this territory, they encounter people who look somewhat different, more robust builds, heavier brow ridges, faces shaped subtly wrong compared to what's familiar. And though some communication proves possible through gesture and shared humanity, the differences are notable, and the interaction carries tension. Two populations meeting where one has been established for tens of thousands of years, and the other is newly arriving. Competition for resources inevitable in regions where both attempt to make living from the same landscape. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before anatomically modern humans arrived from Africa. Their populations adapted to glacial climates, specialized for hunting large game in temperate and cold environments, successful enough to maintain stable presence across vast territories through multiple glacial cycles. And when modern humans began expanding out of Africa around 60 to 70,000 years ago, they eventually reached regions where Neanderthals lived, creating contact between two human species who shared ancestry but had been separated evolutionarily for several 100,000 years, long enough for noticeable differences to accumulate, but not so long that interbreeding became impossible. The nature of interactions between Neanderthals and modern humans remains debated, evidence suggesting both competition and cooperation, conflict and interbreeding, the relationships probably varying by region and circumstance and individual personalities involved. But the broad pattern shows modern humans gradually expanding into Neanderthal territories and Neanderthals eventually disappearing as distinct populations within several thousand years of modern human arrival in any given region, suggesting that competitive pressure from the new arrivals contributed to Neanderthal extinction even if direct violence wasn't the primary mechanism. Competition would have operated through resource overlap, both species hunting similar game, gathering similar plant foods, requiring similar shelter and water resources, meaning that where both occupied the same territory, they competed directly for everything necessary for survival. And in this competition, modern humans apparently held advantages, possibly in population size, allowing them to outnumber Neanderthals in contested regions, possibly in technological sophistication, giving them more efficient resource extraction, possibly in social organization, enabling larger cooperative groups, possibly in cognitive flexibility, allowing faster adaptation to changing conditions. The specific advantages remain unclear, but the outcome demonstrates that modern humans succeeded in occupying regions where they encountered Neanderthals, while Neanderthal populations declined and eventually disappeared. This displacement created both motivation and opportunity for human expansion. Neanderthal-occupied territories represented unclaimed resources from modern human perspective, productive hunting grounds not yet fully exploited by their own populations, creating pull factors that encouraged movement into these regions, while Neanderthal presence also created push factors, groups that attempted to settle in areas where Neanderthals were numerous and resistant to newcomers might face conflict and harassment, making those locations unattractive, pushing modern human groups to move further and seek territories either uninhabited or where Neanderthal numbers were low enough to displace easily. Denisovans, another human species known primarily from genetic evidence and a few fragmentary fossils, occupied parts of Asia and may have ranged from Siberia to Southeast Asia, and modern humans expanding eastward out of Africa encountered these populations as well, again with evidence of both interbreeding and eventual displacement, the pattern similar to what occurred with Neanderthals, though less well documented archaeologically. Homo erectus populations may have still existed in parts of Southeast Asia when modern humans arrived, though the timing is uncertain and evidence is limited. If the species overlapped, then modern humans would have faced competition from these archaic populations as well. Another factor in the complex dynamics of expansion into previously occupied territories. The presence of other human species created a patchwork of occupied and vacant territories, some regions densely populated by long-established archaic humans, other regions empty or lightly populated, and the pattern of modern human expansion probably reflected this geography, moving fastest and most successfully into vacant territories or those with low archaic population density, moving more slowly and with more difficulty into regions where Neanderthals or Denisovans were numerous and well established. The resistance from resident populations shaping the routes and timing of expansion in ways that pure environmental factors alone wouldn't predict. Genetic evidence shows limited interbreeding between modern humans and both Neanderthals and Denisovans, modern non-African populations carrying approximately 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, and some Asian and Oceanian populations carrying additional Denisovan DNA, indicating that the populations didn't remain completely separate. Some individuals crossed species boundaries and produced fertile offspring whose descendants survive in modern populations. But the limited extent of this mixing, just a few percent rather than extensive admixture, suggests that interbreeding was occasional rather than common, perhaps occurring primarily during initial contact periods before populations became established in separate territories, or perhaps limited by cultural barriers or hybrid incompatibilities that reduced the fitness or social acceptance of mixed individuals. The interbreeding that did occur may have provided modern humans with genetic adaptations useful in environments where archaic humans were already established. Neanderthal genes possibly contributing cold-adapted immune functions or other traits that helped modern humans survive in Eurasian environments, Denisovan genes possibly contributing high-altitude adaptations that aided colonization of Tibetan Plateau and other elevated regions, the genetic exchange acting as rapid adaptation mechanism, allowing modern humans to acquire locally adaptive traits without waiting for new mutations and selection to produce them independently. Competition with other human species added another dimension to the pressures driving modern human expansion, not just demographic pressure from population growth or climate pressure from environmental change, but also competitive pressure from interactions with other populations who occupied desirable territories and who had to be displaced or avoided or occasionally absorbed through interbreeding. The three-way dynamic of expansion, competition, and limited mixing, creating the complex pattern of human prehistory where species overlapped temporally and geographically. But ultimately, modern humans emerged as the sole surviving human species globally, the last Neanderthals disappearing around 40,000 years ago, Denisovans perhaps surviving longer in isolated refugia, but eventually extinct as well, leaving Homo sapiens alone, successful in the competitive struggle, but carrying genetic remnants of the species we encountered and partly replaced. Tension builds around the evening fire where two families argue about hunting territories, the disagreement starting from competing claims about who has traditional rights to the valley where deer concentrate each winter, each side citing precedent and past agreements and contributions to group welfare, voices rising, others taking sides or attempting mediation, the dispute not easily resolved because both families have legitimate claims and real needs, the valley genuinely productive enough to matter, but not quite abundant enough to support both families' requirements without conflict. Such disputes occur regularly in any human group, resources rarely distributed with perfect equality, personalities clashing, ambitions conflicting, perceived slights and actual injuries accumulating over time into grudges that poison relationships. And in small face-to-face societies where everyone interacts daily, these conflicts cannot simply be avoided or ignored. They must be resolved or endured, or eventually they fracture the group. The resolution sometimes involves group fission, the arguing families and their supporters agreeing to separate, one group remaining in traditional territory while the other moves away to establish independent existence elsewhere. The split motivated not by resource scarcity or climate pressure or external threats, but by internal social dynamics, making continued cohabitation uncomfortable or impossible. Conflict resolution through geographic separation rather than through violence or forced submission. Archaeological evidence cannot directly observe these social dynamics. Disputes and hurt feelings don't fossilize, but ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers show that group fission often follows social conflict, particularly disputes involving leadership, resource access, or marriage arrangements. And there's no reason to think prehistoric groups differed fundamentally. The same human tendencies toward disagreement and faction formation that appear in modern societies surely operated in ancient ones as well. Leadership disputes provide common source of fission-inducing conflict, ambitious individuals seeking influence and decision-making authority within the group, competing visions of how the community should operate or where it should go or how resources should be allocated. When leadership cannot be clearly resolved through consensus or established precedent, the group may split with each faction, following their preferred leader into separate territories, where they can organize according to their own preferences without constant friction with the opposing faction. Young adults reaching maturity represent particularly likely candidates for fission-motivated movement. Individuals seeking to establish their own households and raise families, but finding limited opportunity within crowded home territories where established adults control the best resources and hold social authority. Moving away offers these young adults opportunity to become big fish in small ponds rather than remaining small fish in big ponds, to establish themselves as founders and leaders of new communities rather than remaining subordinate members of existing ones. The attraction of status and autonomy, motivating voluntary departure, even in absence of resource pressure. Cultural differences can also drive group separation. Subgroups developing distinct practices regarding rituals or food taboos or social organization, the differences perhaps starting small but magnifying over time as each faction reinforces its own identity and views the other as doing things wrong. Eventually, the cultural gap feels wide enough that separation seems preferable to continued cohabitation with people who don't share fundamental values or practices. The group dividing along cultural fault lines with each portion moving far enough apart that they can maintain their preferred practices without constant exposure to the alternative approach that they find objectionable. Marriage patterns and kinship disputes represent another common source of conflict-induced fission, disagreements about who should marry whom. Whether proposed unions follow traditional rules or violate incest taboos or create inappropriate alliances, families feeling that their children were treated unfairly in marriage arrangements or that other families received unfair advantages. The complex web of kinship obligations and marriage exchanges that bind communities together, also creating potential for disputes that can become serious enough to split groups. Violence or serious injury within the group creates ruptures particularly difficult to heal. If one person kills or seriously harms another, the victim's family seeks compensation or revenge, while the perpetrator's family defends their relative. The opposed interests potentially irreconcilable, especially in small communities where face-to-face contact continues daily. Separation may be the only alternative to ongoing feud or to one faction forcing the other into submission or exile. Group fission, allowing both sides to save face and maintain honor while physically removing the source of conflict. Resource disputes, though often resolvable through negotiation and adjustment of territorial boundaries, can escalate into serious conflicts when both parties feel their survival needs aren't being met, or when disputes involve symbolically important resources whose significance exceeds their practical value. Certain hunting grounds or water sources or gathering areas carrying historical or spiritual meaning that makes compromise difficult. When such disputes cannot be resolved to all parties' satisfaction, fission offers escape valve that allows both groups to maintain their principles and dignity while ending the immediate conflict through geographic separation. The cumulative effect of these various social pressures was groups splitting not just when demographic or environmental factors forced division, but also when internal social dynamics made separation attractive, even if resources remained adequate to support united group. Social fission adding another driver of population movement and range expansion beyond the material factors of food and climate, groups moving into new territories not because they had to survive, but because they wanted to escape uncomfortable social situations or establish independent communities or pursue different cultural visions. This social dimension of migration helps explain why human expansion occurred even during climatically favorable periods when resources were adequate, why groups moved into territories that were arguably less productive than what they left behind, why the archaeological record shows continuous population movement and turnover rather than stable occupation of optimal territories, the human preference for social autonomy and status and cultural distinctiveness, creating push factors that operated independently of purely material constraints, making movement and separation normal features of human social organization rather than emergency responses to crisis. The capacity to resolve conflicts through fission rather than violence probably contributed to overall human success. Groups that could split peacefully when tensions rose avoided the deaths and injuries that would result from fighting, maintaining larger total population, even though divided into smaller units, and the separated groups often maintained some level of contact and mutual assistance, sharing information and occasionally intermarrying. The social flexibility allowing humans to balance the advantages of large group size during times of cooperation with the advantages of small group autonomy during times of conflict, switching between united and divided organization as circumstances demanded rather than remaining locked into either extreme. The ocean retreats from its familiar boundaries, daily tides still moving in and out, but the overall sea level dropping steadily over centuries and millennia as global climate cools and vast ice sheets grow in northern latitudes, locking up water that previously filled ocean basins, the falling seas exposing continental shelves that were underwater for thousands of years, gradually revealing hundreds of miles of new coastline as the waterline moves steadily seaward. And what was deep enough for fish becomes shallow enough to wade, then damp enough to walk, then dry enough to support grasses and eventually shrubs and trees, new land appearing as if growing from the sea itself, creating territories where none existed before and offering opportunities for human expansion into regions that would be unreachable as long as seas remained high. The Bering Strait between Asia and North America, currently a 50-mile-wide water barrier separating the continents, closes during glacial maximum periods when sea levels drop 300 feet or more below present levels. The continental shelves on both sides exposed and joining into a broad land bridge, perhaps 1,000 miles wide, stretching from Siberia to Alaska. Not a narrow isthmus to be crossed quickly, but rather an extensive landscape, a subcontinent in its own right called Beringia during its periods of exposure, supporting its own ecosystems of grasslands and tundra and dwarf shrubs, hosting populations of mammoths and bison and other large herbivores, attracting human hunters who followed these herds and gradually expanded eastward from Asia into Alaska without necessarily knowing they were crossing into a different continent. The movement just another range expansion following familiar prey animals into familiar seeming territory, but eventually leading to human colonization of the Americas, the entire Western Hemisphere populated by humans who originally came from Asia via this periodic land bridge that appeared and disappeared with the rhythm of glacial cycles. The timing of American colonization remains somewhat uncertain, clearly accomplished by 15,000 years ago when archaeological sites throughout both North and South America demonstrate human presence, possibly occurring earlier during previous glacial maximum periods when the land bridge existed, but when ice sheet configurations and climate conditions may have prevented movement south from Alaska into the rest of North America. The details debated, but the overall mechanism clear. Falling sea levels during cold periods created the land bridge that made migration possible. Rising sea levels during warm periods destroyed the bridge and isolated American populations from Asia, cutting off further migration and genetic exchange until the next glacial cycle opened the connection again. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, a massive continental shelf underlying the shallow seas between mainland Southeast Asia and the islands of Indonesia and Philippines, exposed extensively during glacial maximum periods, connecting what are now islands into a continuous landmass or nearly continuous with only narrow straits remaining between some islands, allowing human populations to walk from Asian mainland to Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and other land masses that are currently islands. The expanded coastal plains during low sea level periods providing additional territory rich in both terrestrial and marine resources. the combination perhaps explaining the relatively rapid human expansion through this region, reaching eventually to Australia, which required water crossing even during lowest sea levels, but which human populations reached approximately 50,000 years ago, suggesting sophisticated maritime capabilities and willingness to undertake ocean voyages in pursuit of new territories. The Red Sea crossing from Africa to Arabia, currently requiring water transport even at the narrow southern strait, may have been walkable or nearly walkable during extreme low sea level periods, exposing either complete land bridge or island hopping route with narrow channels between exposed areas, potentially offering exit route from Africa that didn't require boats or required only simple rafts capable of crossing brief water gaps, though evidence remains ambiguous about exactly when and how the initial out-of-Africa migration occurred, whether via Red Sea crossing during low sea levels or via northern route through Nile Valley and Sinai Peninsula, which remains passable regardless of sea level. The Mediterranean islands, many currently separated from mainland Europe and North Africa by substantial water barriers, showed different connectivity patterns during low sea levels, some islands connecting to mainland or to each other via exposed land bridges, creating opportunities for human colonization of islands that would otherwise require boat travel. Though even during lowest sea levels, many Mediterranean islands remained separated by water, and archaeological evidence shows human presence on various islands going back tens of thousands of years, indicating that humans developed maritime capabilities and were willing to cross water barriers to reach islands even when land bridges weren't available. The overall effect of these glacially controlled sea level changes was to create a pulsing pattern of opportunity for human expansion, pathways opening during cold periods when ice sheets grew and sea levels fell, allowing movement into new regions or between regions previously separated by water barriers, then pathways closing during warm periods when ice melted and seas rose, isolating populations that had crossed during the previous low stand and cutting off further migration until the next glacial cycle. The pattern potentially producing waves of human expansion timed to glacial cycles rather than smooth, continuous expansion. Groups moving rapidly during windows of opportunity when land bridges existed, then pausing or even contracting during interglacial high sea level periods when expanded oceans reduced available coastal territory and eliminated previously passable land connections. The populations that crossed land bridges during glacial periods and then became isolated when seas rose developed as separate evolutionary trajectories for thousands or tens of thousands of years, until the next glacial cycle opened connections again, creating potential for genetic divergence and cultural differentiation between regions. Though in practice, the timing of human expansion meant that most regions were colonized during relatively recent glacial cycles, without enough time for major evolutionary divergence before subsequent mixing when land bridges reopened or maritime technologies developed that allowed crossing water barriers regardless of sea level. The rising and falling seas acted as valves controlling human movement, opening during cold periods to allow expansion, closing during warm periods to maintain separation, the dynamic creating complex patterns of population movement and mixture that genetic evidence only partially resolves. The drowned continental shelves that served as migration routes and settlement areas during low sea level periods now underwater and inaccessible to archaeology. Their stories preserved only in the genetic patterns of modern populations and the logical inference that human coastal adaptations would have made these exposed shelves attractive territories during their periods of availability. A young hunter climbs the ridge at dawn, not because the group needs him there for any practical purpose, not because game animals are known to concentrate on that particular slope, or because water sources lie beyond, requiring investigation, but simply because the ridge rises against the sky and he wonders what lies on the other side, what the landscape looks like from that elevation, whether valleys beyond might hold resources or whether mountains continue endlessly into distance. The curiosity itself sufficient motivation to spend energy and time on exploration that yields no immediate survival benefit, but satisfies something deeper, the human tendency to investigate, to seek knowledge beyond immediate necessity, to explore simply because unexplored territory exists. This exploratory drive, observable in children across all cultures, who constantly push boundaries and investigate their environments far beyond what adults require of them, in adolescents who seek new experiences and take risks that elders find excessive, in adults who pursue knowledge and travel and novel experiences even when comfortable circumstances would allow remaining safely in familiar territories. This psychological orientation toward exploration and novelty seeking, variable among individuals, with some people cautious and conservative, while others are adventurous and risk tolerant, but present to some degree in most human populations, contributed to range expansion as reliably as demographic pressure or climate change. Some portion of every generation wanting to see what lies beyond the horizon, willing to trade familiar security for the excitement of discovery. And when these individuals explored and found new territories offering adequate resources, their reports back to home groups or their establishment of new settlements in discovered territories opened those regions to broader colonization by less adventurous individuals who would never have explored independently, but who would follow once paths were established and risks reduced. The cognitive capacity for mental mapping and spatial reasoning that allowed humans to navigate complex territories and maintain knowledge of resource locations across vast areas also supported exploratory behavior, being able to maintain orientation while traveling through unfamiliar territory, to create mental maps of new regions, relating them to known geography, to find the way back home after extended explorations. All these capabilities reduce the risk of exploration by making it possible to investigate new territories without becoming hopelessly lost. The confidence that one could explore and return safely, encouraging longer-ranging expeditions and more thorough investigation of adjacent and distant regions. Language allowed explorers to share their discoveries efficiently, describing what they found to others who hadn't traveled with them, conveying information about resources and dangers and routes and distances, enabling groups to make informed decisions about whether discovered territories warranted permanent settlement or just occasional visits. The communication of geographic knowledge multiplying the value of each exploration by allowing everyone to benefit from the information rather than requiring each individual to explore independently. Some individuals within groups probably developed reputations as skilled scouts or explorers, their knowledge of distant territories and their ability to navigate unfamiliar landscapes making them valuable to the community, creating social status and recognition that further encouraged exploration as a valued activity rather than just risky self-indulgence. The cultural framework supporting and rewarding exploratory behavior ensured it continued across generations rather than being suppressed as dangerous or wasteful. Stories and myths about distant lands, legendary territories rich in resources or inhabited by strange peoples or holding spiritual significance, created psychological pull factors, motivating movement toward specific distant goals rather than just random wandering. Whether these stories reflected actual geographic knowledge, distorted through retelling, or emerged from imagination and wish fulfillment, they created mental maps of possibility that drew people outward in pursuit of rumored wonders. Some expeditions finding something approximating the stories they pursued, others finding only mundane reality or discovering that rumors were entirely unfounded. but the pursuit itself extending human geographic knowledge and occasionally opening new territories to settlement. The human capacity for symbolic thought and abstraction meant that exploration could be motivated not just by practical resource needs, but by curiosity about cosmological questions, wanting to know where the sun rises or sets, what lies at the edge of the world, whether the land continues forever or eventually ends. These abstract questions without immediate practical value, but compelling enough that people devoted resources to investigating them, traveling toward horizons to see what lay beyond, following rivers to their sources or to the sea, climbing mountains to see what could be seen from their peaks. The exploration driven by cognitive curiosity, rather than hunger-producing geographic knowledge and expanded range as side effects of pursuing philosophical questions. Young adults seeking independence and identity separate from their parents and established community members, a common feature of human psychology across cultures, sometimes express this developmental drive through physical movement, leaving familiar territories to explore new regions where they could establish themselves as individuals rather than remaining children and subordinates in their home communities. The psychological need for autonomy and self-definition, channeling into geographic exploration and range expansion, creating life transitions that involve both social separation and physical distance. The combination of curious individuals exploring extensively, communication systems sharing geographic knowledge widely, cultural frameworks valuing and rewarding exploration, symbolic thinking generating questions that motivated investigation, and developmental drives toward independence, finding expression through movement. All these psychological and cultural factors, independent of material necessity, created continuous pressure for exploration and range expansion, operating alongside and sometimes exceeding the pressure from resource competition or climate change. Human expansion driven not just by being pushed from behind by scarcity, but also by being pulled from ahead by curiosity and the simple desire to know what's out there, to see what no one from the group has seen before, to be the first to stand on that distant hill or to follow that river to its source. The intrinsic satisfaction of exploration and discovery, providing motivation that needed no external justification. An individual born in a valley where mountains rise to the north and plains extend to the south lives their entire life within perhaps 50 miles of that birthplace. Childhood spent learning the territory within a day's walk of the home camp. Adolescence expanding that knowledge slightly to include more distant hunting grounds and gathering areas. Adulthood spent mostly in familiar zones with occasional trips to visit related groups or attend seasonal gatherings, but never venturing so far that return would be impossible within a few days' travel, and at death buried in soil only 40 miles from the place of birth. A lifetime spent in what seems like a small territory. Intimate knowledge of every stream and grove and rock formation within a limited range, the individual's personal geography bounded and modest. That person's children, born in the same valley, inherit the accumulated knowledge of their parents' territory and build upon it, perhaps exploring slightly farther south into the plains following game herds or investigating rumored resource locations, establishing camps and foraging areas 10 or 20 miles beyond where their parent routinely traveled. And when they reach old age and die, they too remain within the familiar homeland, buried perhaps 60 miles from where their grandparent was born. The family range expanded incrementally, but not dramatically. The grandchildren of the original individual, growing up hearing stories about the valley where their grandparents were born but never visiting it, because it lies 2 days' travel to the north. and there's no pressing reason to make that journey, establish themselves in the southern portion of the family range, marrying into groups whose territories extend even farther south. And their children, the great-grandchildren of the original valley dweller, grow up in plains territory 70 or 80 miles from that ancestral valley, never seeing the mountains that dominated their great-grandparents' horizon, living in landscape that their great-grandparent never visited, adapting to ecosystem different from the one that shaped their family's traditional knowledge. This process, repeated across 40 generations, roughly 1,000 years at 25 years per generation, could move the human presence 2,000 miles from its starting point without any single individual traveling more than 50 miles from birthplace, without any dramatic migrations or conscious decisions to colonize distant territories, just the accumulated drift of successive generations, each settling slightly beyond their parents' core range, each establishing territories that overlap partly, but not completely, with previous generations' territories, the geographic shift gradual and almost imperceptible in any single lifetime, but enormous across multiple generations. And this generational drift explains how human populations expanded from East Africa to Southern Africa, or to the Mediterranean, or eventually to Europe and Asia, within tens of thousands of years, despite the fact that individuals were not long-distance travelers, the species expanding rapidly in archaeological terms, while individuals moved slowly or barely at all in their own lifetimes. The mathematics of this compounding movement are straightforward but profound. If each generation settles on average just 20 miles farther from origin than their parents, a conservative estimate given that groups splitting from parent populations often moved 50 to 100 miles to find unclaimed territories. Then 40 generations covers 800 miles, 80 generations 1,600 miles, 200 generations 4,000 miles, distances sufficient to span continents appearing in the archaeological record as rapid expansion but experienced by individuals as just normal settlement patterns. Most people living and dying near where they were born, only the occasional establishment of new camps or seasonal expansion of foraging ranges at the edges of population distribution, creating the slow, steady outward creep that compounded across centuries into continental crossings. The archaeological record captures only moments in this continuous process. Sites dated to particular time periods showing human presence in particular locations, the gaps between dated sites spanning centuries or millennia, and archaeologists mapping site distributions across these time periods observe progressive expansion, human presence appearing farther from African origins in each successive time period. The pattern interpreted as migration or expansion, but actually representing the cumulative effect of countless small movements, daughter groups budding from parent groups and moving short distances, those daughters budding their own daughters and moving again, the branching tree of population splits, extending outward from African roots like a growing plant, sending runners across the landscape. Each runner extending only slightly, but the whole network eventually covering vast areas. Genetic evidence reveals the same pattern from different perspectives, measuring the variation present in modern populations and using molecular clocks to estimate when populations split from common ancestors, the branching tree of genetic lineages showing serial founder effects consistent with populations repeatedly splitting and moving into new territories, each split taking only subset of parent population's genetic variation and establishing new population from that reduced base. The pattern repeated many times, creating the gradient of decreasing genetic diversity with increasing distance from Africa that characterizes modern human populations. Highest diversity in Africa, where humans have resided longest, allowing mutations to accumulate, progressively lower diversity in populations farther along migration routes because they descend from serial founder groups, each carrying reduced variation compared to their source populations. The speed of this compounding movement varied with circumstances, accelerating during favorable periods when resources were abundant and populations grew rapidly, reaching splitting point every 2 or 3 generations instead of every 4 or 5. The daughter groups establishing themselves farther from parent territories because competition for space near occupied zones pushed them to seek more distant locations. The combination of faster splitting frequency and greater per-split movement distance increasing overall expansion rate significantly during these boom periods. Conversely, during harsh periods when climate deteriorated or disease reduced populations or conflicts increased mortality, expansion slowed or even reversed. Groups contracting toward core territories or populations in marginal areas going extinct without being replaced. The total occupied range shrinking temporarily before expanding again when conditions improved. The overall pattern showing net expansion over millennia, but with local and temporary contractions embedded in the larger trend. The coastal migration route from Africa through southern Asia to Australia shows particularly rapid expansion rate. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggesting human presence reaching Australia approximately 50,000 years ago, only 10 to 20,000 years after the initial out-of-Africa migration, implying average movement rates of perhaps 1 to 2 miles per year, sustained over that period, rapid by human expansion standards and explicable by the continuous availability of coastal resources, eliminating the need to pause while establishing new resource bases, groups simply moving along the shore, exploiting familiar marine foods without requiring extended learning periods or technology development. The ease of coastal movement accelerating the compounding rate by reducing barriers and increasing the distance each generation could move while maintaining adequate resources. Interior expansion occurred more slowly in most regions, groups moving into new ecosystem types facing learning periods while they developed knowledge of local resources and appropriate extraction techniques. The need to adapt creating delays between arrival and successful establishment, slowing overall expansion rates compared to coastal routes where ecosystem remained relatively constant. The cumulative result of these variable rates across thousands of years was human presence appearing globally within roughly 50,000 years of the initial out-of-Africa dispersal. The entire planet, except Antarctica, occupied by populations descending from small founding groups that left Africa carrying the accumulated genetic, cultural, and technological heritage of their ancestors, and spreading that heritage through endless branching and movement until humans occupied every habitable region. The transformation from single African species to global presence, accomplished not through heroic journeys or conscious empire building, but through the mathematical inevitability of compounding movement, small generational drifts accumulated across enough generations to span continents, individuals never traveling far, but the species becoming planetary. Every person carries in their cells a historical record written in the sequence of chemical bases that constitute DNA, the genetic material inherited from parents who inherited from their parents extending back through countless generations, and embedded in this inheritance are patterns that reveal ancient movements, population splits recorded as divergences between genetic lineages, migrations preserved as geographic distributions of particular variants, mixture events captured in unexpected combinations of ancestry, the molecular evidence writing a history that archaeology alone cannot fully resolve because the genetic record travels with living people, rather than depending on fragmentary remains from ancient sites that may never be found or excavated. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively through maternal lineages because mitochondria come only from the egg cell, not from sperm, traces unbroken lines of female descent from contemporary individuals back through thousands of generations toward common ancestors, and analyzing the patterns of variation in mitochondrial DNA sequences from populations worldwide reveals a branching tree of maternal lineages whose geographic distribution maps ancient human movements. The deepest branches, showing greatest diversity, found in African populations, consistent with longest residence time, allowing most mutations to accumulate. The younger branches, showing progressively less diversity, found in non-African populations, consistent with recent dispersal from small founding groups carrying only subset of African variation. The mitochondrial tree shows clear evidence of out-of-Africa bottleneck, non-African lineages descending from just a few African lineages that left the continent, implying small founding population, perhaps just hundreds or few thousands of individuals giving rise to all modern non-African populations. The limited genetic variation passed through that bottleneck, expanding again through subsequent evolution and geographic spread, but never recovering the diversity present in African source populations because evolution produces new variation slowly compared to the expansion time scale. Following the mitochondrial lineages across geography traces migration routes, certain lineage types appearing first in Middle East, then progressively in more distant regions, moving east toward Asia, and eventually the Americas, moving north toward Europe. The distribution suggesting pathways and timing of ancient movements preserved in the geographic pattern of genetic variation, even though the people who did the moving left no archaeological traces, or those traces haven't been found. Y chromosome DNA, inherited exclusively through paternal lineages because Y chromosome passes only from fathers to sons, provides complementary picture tracing male lineages through time and space, and the Y chromosome tree shows similar pattern of African diversity and non-African bottleneck, confirming that both maternal and paternal lineages support the same basic story of human origins in Africa, followed by dispersal outward, carrying reduced genetic variation from small founding populations. The geographic distribution of Y chromosome lineages reveals additional details not evident from mitochondrial DNA alone, some regions showing patterns suggesting male-biased migration or patrilocal residence patterns where women moved to join husbands' groups while men remained in natal territories, other regions showing more balanced patterns. The comparison between maternal and paternal genetic evidence revealing gender-specific aspects of ancient social organization and movement patterns that would be invisible in archaeological record. Autosomal DNA, the chromosomes inherited from both parents and mixing each generation through recombination, provides more complex picture because patterns get scrambled by sexual reproduction more quickly than uniparentally inherited mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA. But the autosomal genome carries vastly more information, thousands of times more genetic variation than mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA combined, and sophisticated statistical methods can extract ancient population histories from autosomal variation despite the complexity, reconstructing population splits and mixing events and demographic changes extending back tens of thousands of years. The resolution sufficient to identify not just major migration events, but also secondary movements and interactions between populations that split and then partially remixed through later contact. The autosomal evidence reveals Neanderthal admixture in non-African populations, modern humans outside Africa carrying approximately 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA spread across their genomes, indicating interbreeding between the species when modern humans expanded into territories where Neanderthals lived, probably during early contact period shortly after modern humans left Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations in Middle East or Europe, the mixing producing hybrid offspring who contributed to modern human populations. Their Neanderthal genetic heritage persisting to present day, distributed as short chromosome segments scattered across contemporary genomes, the fragmented distribution showing that mixing occurred long ago, allowing many generations of recombination to break up the contributed Neanderthal chromosomes into short pieces. Similarly, autosomal evidence reveals Denisovan admixture in populations from Asia and Oceania, modern people from these regions carrying Denisovan DNA, indicating interbreeding with this archaic human species, whose physical remains are known from only few fossils, but whose genetic legacy persists in millions of contemporary people. The geographic distribution of Denisovan ancestry, suggesting that modern humans encountered this species in Asia, probably during eastward expansion from the out-of-Africa source, and some degree of interbreeding produced viable fertile offspring whose descendants carried Denisovan genes into expanding modern human populations that eventually reached Australia and Pacific Islands. The quantity and distribution of archaic human DNA in modern populations provides evidence about the nature of interactions between species. The relatively small percentage of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry suggesting that mixing was limited, not extensive, probably representing occasional interbreeding rather than full population merger, and the fragments of archaic DNA that remain in modern populations show some evidence of natural selection, certain Neanderthal or Denisovan gene variants providing advantages in immune function or metabolism or other traits that helped modern humans survive in new environments, these beneficial variants increasing in frequency over generations. While most archaic DNA was gradually eliminated through selection against mildly deleterious variants or through random drift, the patterns of archaic ancestry distribution across modern genomes, revealing both the history of ancient contact and the subsequent evolution shaping which pieces of archaic heritage persisted and which were lost. The genetic evidence also reveals population structure within ancient migrations, not single homogeneous expansion, but rather complex patterns of multiple groups moving at different times along different routes, mixing and splitting and sometimes moving back toward source regions, creating patterns that genetic analysis can partially reconstruct. The molecular evidence showing that human expansion was messy and complex, not simple linear progression from origin to destination, but rather a web of movements in multiple directions, with populations fissioning and fusing repeatedly. The complexity recorded in genetic patterns where different chromosome regions sometimes tell slightly different stories, reflecting the multiple contributing populations and migration events that shaped ancestry. The landscape before human arrival holds megafauna, giant animals that evolved in absence of human hunting pressure, mammoths and mastodons weighing several tons browsing on vegetation, giant ground sloths standing taller than modern elephants reaching into trees to pull down branches. Megafauna marsupials in Australia, including 3-meter-tall kangaroos and rhinoceros-sized wombats, saber-toothed cats and dire wolves and enormous bears. These large animals dominating ecosystems where they evolved gradually over millions of years, developing behaviors and life histories tuned to environments where humans didn't exist. many of these species showing no particular fear of humans when first encountered because their evolutionary history included no selection for avoiding these relatively small bipedal predators. Archaeological and paleontological evidence shows striking pattern megafauna extinctions following shortly after human arrival in most regions. The large animals that survived millions of years of climate changes and environmental shifts disappearing within centuries or few millennia of humans colonizing their territories. The timing strongly suggesting human role in extinctions, even though debate continues about relative contributions of hunting versus climate change versus other factors. The coincidence of human arrival and megafauna disappearance repeated across continents, suggesting more than chance correlation. From Australia, where large marsupials went extinct around 50,000 years ago when humans arrived, to North and South America, where mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and numerous other large species disappeared between 15 and 10,000 years ago following human colonization of the Americas, to islands throughout Pacific and Caribbean where smaller megafauna, including giant flightless birds and large tortoises, disappeared following human arrival much more recently within last few thousand years. The mechanism of extinction probably involved combination of direct hunting pressure, removing individuals faster than populations could reproduce, particularly problematic for large animals with long generation times and small populations naturally, and indirect effects of human presence including habitat modification through fire use, competition with domesticated dogs for prey, introduction of novel diseases, disruption of migration patterns or breeding behaviors, the multiple impacts compounding to push already vulnerable species past their ability to sustain populations. Large, naive animals showing no fear of humans would have been particularly easy prey during initial contact periods, approaching humans out of curiosity or simply failing to flee when hunters approached, allowing kills that wouldn't be possible with experienced wary prey that had evolved anti-predator behaviors effective against human hunting strategies. And this initial period of easy hunting might have depleted populations severely before survivors learned appropriate fear responses, by which point populations had already been reduced to levels from which recovery proved impossible. The loss of these megafauna transformed ecosystems dramatically. Large herbivores had controlled vegetation through browsing, maintaining grasslands and preventing forest encroachment in many regions, their removal allowing vegetation structure to change. Forests expanding into former grasslands, shrub communities changing character without mega-herbivore pressure. These vegetation changes in turn affecting other species dependent on particular habitat structures, cascading effects spreading through ecosystems as keystone species were removed. Large predators that specialized on megafauna prey also went extinct, saber-toothed cats and dire wolves and other carnivores losing their food base when their preferred prey disappeared, unable to adapt quickly enough to exploit smaller alternative prey or to compete effectively with human hunters for remaining large animals. The extinction of megafauna triggering secondary extinctions among their predators and scavengers. Surviving species adapted to the transformed ecosystems, smaller herbivores sometimes expanding into niches previously occupied by extinct megafauna, plant communities adjusting to reduced browsing pressure, predator populations restructuring around available prey. But the ecosystems that emerged after megafauna extinctions differed fundamentally from those that existed before human arrival, simplified in some ways with fewer large animal species, altered in structure and function, representing new ecological states rather than simple continuations of previous conditions. The debate about human responsibility for these extinctions continues. Some researchers emphasizing that extinctions coincided with climate changes at the end of glacial periods and might primarily reflect environmental changes rather than human hunting, noting that megafauna survived previous glacial cycles without extinction and attributing the difference to unusual severity of the most recent climate shift or to cumulative effects of multiple stresses. But the strongest counterargument remains the timing. Extinctions occurring at different times on different continents, closely matching human arrival in each region, rather than matching any global climate event, and the survival of megafauna in Africa, where humans evolved gradually alongside these animals, allowing them to develop appropriate anti-predator behaviors, suggesting that sudden human arrival in regions where megafauna had no previous experience with human hunting created particularly severe impact that climate change alone wouldn't produce. The transformation of ecosystems through megafauna extinction represents human impact on planetary scale, fundamentally altering the structure and function of biological communities across multiple continents within geologically brief time period, demonstrating that even small human populations with relatively simple technologies could dramatically change environments, not through intentional management or agriculture, which came later, but simply through hunting and presence affecting ecosystems in ways that propagated through ecological networks. This early impact foreshadows the much larger environmental transformations that followed as human populations grew, technologies developed, and eventually agriculture enabled massive landscape modifications. But the megafauna extinctions show that human environmental impact began essentially at the moment our ancestors left Africa and encountered animals unfamiliar with human hunting capabilities, the expansion of human range inevitably bringing ecological changes as surely as it brought genetic changes and cultural changes, arriving humans not just occupying new territories, but transforming them through their presence and activities. The story that accumulates across these thousands of years and millions of individual lives reveals migration driven fundamentally by mathematical certainty. Populations doubling every 25 to 30 years under favorable conditions, inevitably exceeding any fixed territory's carrying capacity of perhaps 2 to 20 people per square mile, sustainable with hunter-gatherer technology, forcing daughter groups to split off every 50 to 75 years when parent populations reached 70 to 80 individuals, each daughter group moving 20 to 50 miles seeking unclaimed territories. And this demographic rhythm repeated thousands of times across hundreds of generations, compounding small movements into continental crossings covering 6,000 to 10,000 miles within 2,000 to 3,000 years, without any individual traveling more than 50 to 100 miles from birthplace. The mathematical progression driving range expansion. As surely as water flows downhill, not requiring adventurous spirit or expansion ideology, but simply responding to the biological fact that successful survival produces more people than any given landscape can indefinitely support, making movement not optional exploration, but inevitable consequence of reproductive success. Climate fluctuations added pressure beyond simple demography. African megadroughts during glacial periods concentrating populations into shrinking refugia around permanent water sources, creating competition that motivated some groups to move toward less crowded regions, even if those regions offered marginally less productive environments than crowded core areas. Heinrich events disrupting northern climates every 7 to 10,000 years, forcing sudden adaptations or relocations, monsoon failures creating temporary but severe scarcity that pushed groups to track shifting resource availability across landscapes. the accumulated effect of climate variability over tens of thousands of years, being populations constantly nudged toward geographic dispersal, staying mobile and maintaining broad environmental knowledge, providing insurance against local climate failures, groups that adapted flexibly, surviving better than those that specialized too narrowly to single environment types. Coastal migration routes provided highways of abundance following shorelines from Red Sea through southern Asia toward Australia. Sea levels during glacial periods 200 to 300 feet lower than present, exposing continental shelves that extended shorelines hundreds of miles seaward from current coastlines. Beachcombing and shellfish gathering providing reliable calories without requiring new technology or learning periods as groups moved along essentially constant ecosystem type. The continuous resource availability enabling rapid expansion averaging perhaps 1 to 2 miles per year, sustained over 15,000 years, sufficient to reach Australia by 50,000 years ago. Genetic evidence showing southern coastal route as primary pathway for initial out-of-Africa dispersal with subsequent movements inland from coastal footholds. River valleys provided similar corridors through continental interiors, the Nile connecting tropical Africa to Mediterranean zones, the Danube providing pathway across Europe, massive Asian river systems offering routes into continental interiors, each river maintaining reliable water and concentrated resources that supported movement while reducing navigation difficulty. Groups following watercourses upstream or downstream, naturally extending their ranges along these linear oases through landscapes that away from rivers would be much harder to traverse and settle. Following animal migrations pulled human groups into new territories, tracking familiar prey. Reindeer herds moving north in spring toward Arctic summer pastures, drawing human hunters into high-latitude zones. Salmon runs concentrating protein in rivers at predictable times, creating seasonal destinations that expanded total territory occupied, even if not permanently settled. The accumulated effect of following multiple species with different migration patterns, being human groups, maintaining extremely broad geographic knowledge and mobility across hundreds of miles of landscapes visited seasonally. Technological capabilities enabled survival in environments that would otherwise be uninhabitable. Fire mastery, allowing existence in cold climates where unprotected humans would die of exposure within hours. Clothing systems using animal furs and hides providing portable insulation that made Arctic zones accessible. Hafted tools and weapons improving hunting efficiency. Food storage and preservation methods, buffering seasonal scarcity. Shelter construction knowledge, allowing creation of adequate housing wherever materials existed. The cumulative technological package transforming humans from tropical primates into species capable of surviving anywhere on the planet, from equatorial rainforests to Arctic tundra. The flexibility coming not from biological adaptation, but from cultural and technological solutions developed and transmitted through social learning rather than genetic inheritance, allowing rapid expansion across diverse environments without waiting for evolutionary adaptation. Competition with other human species added another dimension. Neanderthals occupying Europe and Western Asia, creating both obstacles and opportunities for expanding modern human populations, some regions contested and difficult to enter, while others remained available. The eventual displacement of Neanderthals opening territories, but also involving complex dynamics of competition, occasional interbreeding, contributing 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA to modern non-African populations. Similarly, Denisovans in Asia interbreeding with expanding modern humans, leaving genetic legacy in contemporary Asian and Oceanian populations. the competitive interactions shaping migration routes and timing, while also providing some genetic adaptations useful in new environments. The disappearance of other human species within thousands of years of modern human arrival, suggesting competitive pressure, contributed significantly to their extinction, even if not through direct violence necessarily, but through resource competition and gradual displacement. Social factors independent of material necessity also drove movement. Conflicts over resources or leadership or marriage arrangements sometimes resolved through group fission, where one faction moved away rather than continuing confrontation. Young adults seeking status and independence, establishing new groups beyond parental territories. Even when resource pressure didn't require movement, cultural differences emerging and motivating separation. When subgroups developed distinct practices and values, making cohabitation uncomfortable, the social dimension of migration explaining movements into territories no more productive than those being left, and expansions occurring even during climatically favorable periods when resources were adequate. Human preference for social autonomy and cultural distinctiveness creating push factors operating independently of environmental constraints. Geographic opportunities during glacial periods opened temporary pathways. Bering Land Bridge connecting Asia to Americas, enabling colonization of Western Hemisphere. Sunda Shelf exposing connections between Southeast Asian islands. Lowered sea levels generally expanding coastal territories and creating routes that disappeared when climate warmed and seas rose. The pulsing pattern of opportunity timed to glacial cycles, potentially producing waves of human expansion during cold periods when land bridges existed, followed by isolation. During warm periods when rising seas cut connections. Though specific timing of human movements didn't always align with maximum glacial extent, because factors beyond just sea level influenced where and when populations moved. The cumulative result written in archaeological sites showing progressive human presence farther from Africa over time, in genetic patterns showing decreasing diversity with distance from Africa, and branching lineages marking population splits and movements, in the transformed ecosystems where megafauna disappeared following human arrival, in the global distribution of modern human populations inhabiting every terrestrial environment, all evidence converging on story of African origin, followed by dispersal outward within 50 to 70,000 years, covering the entire planet except Antarctica, accomplished through combination of demographic necessity as populations repeatedly exceeded local carrying capacities, forcing splits and movements, environmental pressure as climate changes created scarcity and variability, making flexibility advantageous, technological capability as fire and clothing and tools enabled survival in diverse climates, geographic opportunity as changing sea levels opened pathways, social motivations as conflicts and ambitions drove separations, competitive dynamics as interactions with other human species shaped who moved where, and simple human curiosity as exploratory individuals investigated beyond familiar horizons and occasionally found territories worth settling. Not single cause, but rather multiple interconnected factors, not heroic conquest or manifest destiny, but demographic mathematics compounded across generations. Not dramatic exodus, but gradual drift, each generation settling slightly beyond previous one's range. Movement seeming rapid in archaeological perspective, spanning thousands of years, but experienced as normal settlement patterns in individual lifetimes. The transformation from African species to global humanity achieved through patience of deep time, allowing small movements to compound into planetary presence, revealing that human expansion resulted not from being fundamentally different from other species in some dramatic way, but rather from possessing specific combination of traits. demographic success, producing excess population, requiring movement, technological flexibility, allowing survival in diverse environments, social organization, enabling cooperation and knowledge transmission, cognitive capacity, supporting learning and innovation and long-term planning. The combination creating species that could and would spread across every available landscape once the initial dispersal out of Africa began. The inevitability of expansion built into human biology and culture and technology, making global distribution not surprising outcome requiring explanation, but rather predictable result of human characteristics interacting with environmental opportunities across sufficient time. The story of why humans migrated, ultimately revealing itself as story of what it means to be human, successful, adaptable, social, curious, reproductive, and ultimately relentless, moving ever outward. Not because any individual intended to colonize the world, but because each generation responded to immediate circumstances in ways that compounded across time into global transformation, the mathematics of successful survival creating planetary humanity.